Lawmakers today raising transparency concerns over a new virus outbreak in China. A whistleblower recently telling our sister media, the Epoch Times, that the Chinese Communist Party is secretly ordering officials to downplay the outbreak, which is overwhelming hospitals throughout China. Reports now that this mystery pneumonia is now in the United States, in Ohio and in Massachusetts. Congress is now probing the CDC to find out how the agency is responding. NTD's Melina Wisecup reports from Capitol Hill.
Overwhelming many hospitals. Infections of this pneumonia are spreading quickly among children in China and have now even extended to adults, with medications being useless to help. Chinese reports indicate that the request for medical care is so high that Beijing has been forced to reopen makeshift hospitals just to cope. Here's what the CDC director had to say about this new virus when testifying before a House committee.
Correct. Not a novel virus. Again, we have been in close touch with our counterparts in China, and that information has been corroborated.
And you feel confident that China's being transparent with them as for the information that you have?
Well, I think, scientific diplomacy is incredibly important in that part of the world.
This comes as an insider account reveals that the rest of the world and even those inside China may be left in the dark about the reality of this new outbreak. A whistleblower told our sister media outlet, the Epoch Times, that the CCP leader Xi Jinping has actually ordered officials to downplay reporting of this new respiratory illness and to avoid using the term COVID-19.
They're not forthcoming. They don't want to lose face, and as a result, people die. And so we've got to keep an eye on it.
That being said, we still have the same problem we had in some sense with COVID, which is like the data coming out of China is so opaque, there's no transparency, and that's what makes it hard to analyze what the risk is beyond China's borders.
The Energy and Commerce Committee has asked the CDC to be on guard about this new outbreak and to better prepare to provide more transparency into the true nature of the virus.
They didn't tell us the truth during COVID. They held back on what was happening probably for weeks, if not months, which resulted in a worldwide pandemic. So I'm skeptical also about what's happening in China, and we need to know what it is.
Now the Energy and Commerce Committee is requesting the CDC to answer a long list of questions on the virus by December 13th, including things such as if the CCP has tried to withhold or delay providing information about this virus and what information, if any, has the CDC received from China on the virus. Reporting from Capitol Hill, Melina Wisecup, NTD News.
President Biden hosting the Angolan president today, seeking to weaken Beijing's influence on the African continent. Joining us now is NTD's White House correspondent, Iris Tao. Good evening, Iris. What was announced and what makes this meeting significant?
Good evening to you, Steve. So President Biden's meeting today with Angolan President Lorenzo comes as Biden is seeking to expand U.S. ties with Africa, where the Chinese Communist Party is also seeking to expand its influence. For example, Angola is already the biggest debtor in Africa to China, owing China some $40 billion in debt and having to pay back some of it using its oil. And now President Biden is presenting to these African countries U.S. investments under what's called the Lobito Corridor Project, which is an U.S. alternative to China's Belt and Road Initiative that administration says often turns out to be debt traps. Here's what President Biden is saying at the bilateral meeting today. Watch.
Africa, 1 billion people, and critically important how it functions for the whole world.
África é continente de 1 bilhão de pessoas e é de importância crítica para o mundo inteiro.
And no country more important than Angola.
E em África nenhum país é mais importante que Angola.
And President Lorenzo, who's been shifting Angola away from Chinese influence and now shifting closer to the U.S., praised President Biden today for, quote, opening a new page in U.S.-Africa relations. Meanwhile, there were concerns, however, about African countries feeling neglected by the United States, as it seems like President Biden is set to break his promise earlier that he's going to visit Africa by the end of this year. Biden today, however, did promise that he's going to go back to Angola, though he didn't specify when. Steve.
Certainly a lot on President Biden's plate with two wars that the U.S. is heavily involved in, if not directly but indirectly. So what is the White House saying about Israel today as the truce in Gaza gets extended to a seventh day now, Iris?
So the White House is welcoming that, saying that it actually like to see this truce getting extended by another 1, 2, or 3 days. Meanwhile, the White House also emphasizes that when Israel resumes fighting after the temporary pause in fighting, the White House will continue to have its back. Watch.
That they will continue to have United States support as they go after these terrorists. And again, just look at what happened today in Jerusalem. I mean, if anybody's guessing and wondering whether Hamas still has murderous intentions against the Israeli people, just look at what happened in Jerusalem today.
And that, as you heard, is the White House condemning what it calls a terrorist attack today in Jerusalem by Hamas, where 3 people were shot. The White House today also again made clear that while it supports temporary pauses in fighting, it does not support a permanent ceasefire. Back to you.
NTD's Iris Tao reporting live from the White House. Iris, thank you. In Washington, D.C. today, Twitter Files journalists testifying. 1 year after the first Twitter Files report, 2 journalists returned for a House subcommittee hearing on the federal government's involvement in social media censorship. NTD's legal correspondent Arlene Richards brings us more.
Do you swear or affirm under penalty?
Journalists involved in the so-called Twitter Files reports haven't spoken to Congress since March. But on Thursday, Matt Taibbi and Michael Schellenberger gave testimony for the second time before a House subcommittee focused on government censorship. The subcommittee is re-examining the federal government's involvement in social media censorship, as well as what it calls attacks on independent journalism and free expression. Chair Jim Jordan kicked off the hearing by praising Taibbi and Schellenberger for exposing the Twitter Files. The Twitter Files are thousands of records of conversations between company employees about their content moderation decisions. CEO Elon Musk authorized the incremental release of the files in December 2022. Taibbi and Schellenberger posted discussions to highlight the company's decision-making process around some high-profile actions. Jordan said the journalists have been targeted for their efforts.
And when we first had Mr. Taibbi and Mr. Schellenberger testify back in March, an IRS agent showed up at Matt Taibbi's door, where I say, while they are testifying, while Mr. Taibbi is testifying in front of the committee about the weaponization of government, the IRS was actually at that very moment knocking on his door. There's not one person who thinks that was just chance.
He said the committee has exposed other incidents of the federal government's attempts to censor Americans. Schellenberger said Homeland Security and the FBI were involved.
FBI agents were directly flagging content to Twitter saying this appears to violate your terms of service. What about this? What about that? Same thing with DHS staff. And then, of course, DHS created the Election Integrity Partnership, which then became the Virality Project, which was in the process of demanding mass censorship of America.
Democratic Representative Dan Goldman argued that only 13% of flagged content was removed.
So you see them constantly trying to change the terms of service. You see them, it was 35% of the URLs that were, this according to EIP, were labeled removed or soft blocked. That's all forms of censorship. That censorship is not just removal.
But 65% were not. So how can the government be so coercive?
So does the First Amendment say that the government
for the course on government efficiency?
Does the First Amendment say the government can censor 45%?
Time of the gentleman has expired. They're not censoring. They're flagging in the social media companies.
So under coercion,
35% of a First Amendment? Or?
It's not the First Amendment. It's the terms of service, as you said, and they are flagging it for the social media companies to make their own decisions. That is not the First Amendment. That is the terms of service.
At the conclusion of the hearing, the chair said he would like to continue having hearings about censorship and that he plans to invite the journalists to come back again. Arlene Richards, NTD News.
So who is ultimately responsible for sealing the evidence related to UAPs, otherwise known as UFOs? On Capitol Hill today, several lawmakers saying their efforts in demanding transparency have been stonewalled by the intelligence community. NTD's Sam Wong has the details.
Since the 1940s, unidentified anomalous phenomenon, or UAPs, have been investigated by politicians and scientists alike. But to this day, much of the information regarding these possibly extraterrestrial aircraft remains tightly sealed. This year, a growing number of lawmakers have pushed for full disclosure surrounding the phenomena, but have repeatedly encountered roadblocks. According to Congressman Tim Burchett, the pushback has come not from any elected body, but rather from the intelligence community. Burchett has led several efforts demanding the full declassification of UAP information. That includes an amendment to this year's National Defense Authorization Act That would require the Defense Department to release all relevant materials that would not put national security at risk. Burchett said today that the issue ultimately comes down to transparency.
But why are we classifying so much about this, especially if the information doesn't jeopardize national security, and we have departments telling us that they do not exist?
Back in July, Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer spearheaded legislation called the UAP Disclosure Act, but the bill has received a mixed response from both sides of the aisle. Congressman Burchett told me the concern is that the legislation would require an appointed panel to review all the classified materials.
The American public would have no control over it. It would be appointed by a politician. You know who would be on there. You'd have the missile defense companies. You'd have the usual cast of characters.
When asked about progress towards full disclosure, some House member told me that Congress is moving in the right direction.
Schumer's efforts here are probably the floor as to where we would like to see disclosure begin. Again, going back to just what we have faced, it shouldn't be the case that it is this complicated to release this information.
I think we're making a lot of progress. We just have to accept the fact that the pace here in Washington, that we're caught up in that same pace.
But it remains to be seen how soon declassification and disclosure will take place. Reporting from Washington, D.C., Sam Wong, NTD News.
Thank you for watching the Capitol Report. If you want to see our full broadcast, check us out at epochtv.com.